The merciless Kansas sun beat down on 72-year-old Ezra Whitman as he lay motionless in the tall prairie grass, his weathered body broken by the beating he had received from the men who had once called him friend and neighbor. Blood from a gash on his forehead had dried in the dust, and his left leg was bent at an unnatural angle where Vernon Pike's boot had connected with bone and sinew. Ezra's crime had been simple: refusing to sell his 1,000-acre ranch to the Kansas Pacific Railroad for a fraction of its worth. For 3 generations, the Whitman family had worked this land, building it from raw prairie into one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the territory. His grandfather had fought Indians to claim it. His father had survived droughts and blizzards to improve it. And Ezra himself had spent 50 years making it a legacy worthy of his children and grandchildren. But Ezra's children were all dead now, claimed by fever, war, and the countless dangers of frontier life. His wife Sarah had followed them to the grave 5 years earlier, leaving him alone with nothing but memories and the stubborn determination that had carried the Whitman name through decades of hardship. The railroad wanted his land because it sat astride the most direct route between Kansas City and Denver, and the right-of-way through his property would save them millions of dollars in construction costs. When Ezra had refused their initial offer of $500 for land worth 50 times that amount, they had sent increasingly aggressive representatives to change his mind through intimidation and threats. Vernon Pike, the railroad's chief enforcer, had arrived at Ezra's ranch that morning with 6 armed men and an ultimatum: sign the deed transfer or face the consequences. When Ezra had told them to get off his land, Pike had smiled with cold satisfaction and ordered his men to teach the old rancher about the price of defying progress. They had beaten him methodically, professionally, with the kind of calculated violence that was designed to inflict maximum pain without immediately causing death. Pike wanted Ezra to suffer, to have time to contemplate his stubbornness while lying helpless on the prairie where his body would eventually be found by scavengers. Should have taken our generous offer. "Old man," Pike had said as his men prepared to leave Ezra to die alone, "now you get to spend your last hours thinking about how your foolish pride cost you everything." They had ridden away laughing, leaving Ezra with multiple broken ribs, a shattered leg, and internal injuries that would probably prove fatal within hours. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and Ezra lacked the strength to crawl even a fraction of that distance through the unforgiving prairie grass. As the sun climbed higher and vultures began circling overhead, Ezra found himself thinking not about his own approaching death, but about the family that had once filled his ranch house with laughter and love. Sarah's gentle voice seemed to whisper encouragement from somewhere beyond the physical world, reminding him of the faith that had sustained them through decades of frontier challenges. "Not yet, my love," Ezra whispered through cracked lips, his voice barely audible even to himself. "The good Lord's not finished with me yet." The sound of approaching horses caused Ezra to raise his head with tremendous effort, hoping against hope that help might be coming from an unexpected source. But his heart sank as he recognized the riders, Tom and Martha Henderson, returning from town with their 3 young children packed into a wagon loaded with supplies. The Hendersons were decent people who had been Ezra's neighbors for 15 years. But Tom was also a practical man who understood the political realities of dealing with powerful interests like the railroad. He had already sold his own land to Pike's company, accepting a modest payment in exchange for avoiding the kind of trouble that had befallen Ezra. "Dear God," Martha Henderson gasped as she saw Ezra's broken form in the grass. "Tom, we have to help him." Tom Henderson's face showed the internal conflict between compassion and self-preservation as he looked at Ezra's injuries and considered the implications of getting involved. "Martha, if Pike finds out we helped Ezra, we could lose everything. The railroad doesn't tolerate interference with their business. He's dying, Tom." Martha protested, her maternal instincts overriding her husband's practical concerns. We can't just leave him here to die." But Tom's fear of Pike's retribution proved stronger than his conscience, and he shook his head with the finality of a man who had already made his peace with moral compromise. "I'm sorry, Ezra, but I've got my own family to think about. Pike made it clear what happens to people who help his enemies." Ezra watched with growing despair as the Henderson wagon continued past his location, the three children staring back at him with wide eyes that would probably be haunted by this moment for the rest of their lives. Even Martha's protests gradually faded as she accepted her husband's decision to prioritize their own safety over an old man's life. The abandonment by people he had considered friends cut deeper than any physical injury Pike's men had inflicted. Ezra had always believed that frontier communities were bound together by mutual aid and shared hardship, but the railroad's influence had apparently corrupted even those basic human connections. As the Henderson wagon disappeared over a distant ridge, Ezra closed his eyes and prepared to meet whatever judgment awaited him in the next world. He had lived a good life by his own standards, treating his neighbors fairly and honoring the memory of his departed family. But he wondered if God would consider that sufficient when weighed against his failures and shortcomings. The smell of smoke drifting across the prairie caused Ezra to open his eyes with sudden alarm, his rancher's instincts immediately recognizing the distinctive odor of burning grass. Somewhere to the west, a prairie fire had started, and the wind was carrying it directly toward his position with the relentless speed that made such blazes one of the most feared dangers of plains life. Ezra struggled to raise himself up on his elbows, squinting against the afternoon glare to locate the source of the smoke. On the western horizon, he could see an orange glow that seemed to be expanding with terrifying speed, consuming thousands of acres of drought-dried grass and everything in its path. The fire was still miles away, but prairie blazes could travel faster than a galloping horse under the right conditions. And the steady wind that had been cooling Ezra's broken body was now carrying destruction toward him at a pace that would reach his location within hours. More importantly, the fire was also bearing down on the Henderson homestead, where Tom and Martha had undoubtedly arrived to find their property directly in the path of the inferno. The same family that had abandoned Ezra to die was now facing their own potential destruction, along with their three innocent children who had done nothing to deserve such a fate. Ezra's conscience wrestled with his sense of justice as he watched the approaching fire and contemplated the Henderson family's predicament. They had left him to die rather than risk Pike's displeasure. But their children were blameless victims who deserved protection regardless of their parents' moral failures. "Sarah," Ezra whispered to his departed wife, "what would you have me do?" The answer came not in words, but in a surge of strength that seemed to flow from somewhere beyond his broken body, giving him the power to drag himself upright despite the agony that movement caused. Whatever time he had left would be spent trying to save innocent lives rather than wallowing in self-pity about his own approaching death. Using a fallen fence post as a crude crutch, Ezra began the tortuous journey toward the Henderson homestead, driven by a determination that transcended his physical limitations and the betrayal he had suffered. The fire might claim his life, but it would not claim his soul or the lives of children who trusted adults to protect them from dangers beyond their understanding. The orange glow on the western horizon had transformed into a wall of flame 30 feet high when Ezra Whitman finally reached the Henderson homestead, his broken body sustained by nothing more than sheer willpower and the desperate knowledge that innocent lives hung in the balance. The journey that should have taken 30 minutes had consumed nearly 3 hours, and the prairie fire was now less than 2 miles away and advancing with the speed of a runaway locomotive. Tom and Martha Henderson were frantically loading their wagon with whatever possessions they could salvage before fleeing their home, their faces showing the panic of people who had waited too long to acknowledge the magnitude of the approaching disaster. Their 3 children, aged 6 to 12, stood huddled together near the house, their young faces reflecting terror and confusion about the inferno bearing down on their world. "Henderson!" Ezra called out as he stumbled into their yard, his voice hoarse from pain and smoke inhalation. "The fire's moving too fast. You'll never outrun it with a loaded wagon." Tom Henderson spun around in shock at the sight of the old rancher he had left for dead hours earlier, his face showing a mixture of guilt and disbelief. "Ezra, how did you—" "We thought Pike's men had—" "They tried," Ezra replied grimly, leaning heavily on his makeshift crutch as he assessed the family's desperate preparations. "But dying can wait. Right now we need to get your children to safety." Martha Henderson's eyes filled with tears as she realized the magnitude of Ezra's sacrifice in coming to warn them despite their abandonment of him. "Oh, Ezra, I'm so sorry. Tom was afraid of what Pike might do if we helped you. But I should have insisted. No time for apologies now." Ezra cut her off, his attention focused on the approaching wall of flame that was consuming everything in its path with terrifying efficiency. "The fire will be here in less than an hour, and your wagon won't move fast enough to escape it." Tom Henderson's face showed his growing desperation as he realized the futility of his evacuation plan. "Then what do we do? There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide." Ezra's mind was working through possibilities with the methodical precision that had made him a successful rancher for 5 decades. His knowledge of the local terrain, accumulated through years of hunting and cattle drives, suddenly provided a solution that might save the Henderson children even if it cost the adults their lives. "Miller's Creek," Ezra said with sudden certainty. "There's a deep pool about 2 miles southeast of here, surrounded by rocks and sand. If we can get the children there, they can wait in the water while the fire passes over them." The plan was dangerous and uncertain, requiring them to travel toward the fire rather than away from it. But it offered better odds of survival than trying to outrun the blaze across open prairie. The creek's water and the cleared area around it would provide protection from the flames, while the rocky terrain would give them something to shelter behind. 2 miles? Tom Henderson's voice cracked with despair. "Ezra, you can barely walk, and little Annie can't run that far. We'll never make it in time." Ezra looked at the Henderson children, seeing in their frightened faces the same innocence and trust that had characterized his own grandchildren before disease and accident had claimed them. 8-year-old Annie Henderson was indeed too small to cover 2 miles of rough terrain at the speed that would be required to stay ahead of the fire. "I'll carry her," Ezra said simply, though every movement sent waves of agony through his broken ribs and shattered leg. "You and Martha take the boys and lead the way. I'll follow with Annie." Martha Henderson stared at Ezra in amazement, understanding that he was proposing to carry her daughter despite injuries that would have incapacitated most men half his age. "Ezra, you can't possibly— Your leg is broken. Your ribs— My legs have carried me through 50 years on this prairie," Ezra replied with quiet determination. "They'll carry me through one more journey if it means saving these children." The smoke was growing thicker now, making breathing difficult and visibility poor, while the roar of the approaching fire created a constant background noise that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. There was no more time for discussion or planning. They had to move immediately or face certain death. Tom Henderson made the agonizing decision to abandon his home and possessions, gathering only essential supplies, while Martha helped the children prepare for the desperate flight to Miller's Creek. 8-year-old Annie looked up at Ezra with the trusting eyes of a child who believed that adults could solve any problem, and her faith gave him strength that transcended his physical limitations. "Hold on tight, little one," Ezra whispered as he lifted Annie onto his back, ignoring the explosion of pain that the movement caused throughout his battered body. "We're going on an adventure, and I need you to be brave for me." The journey to Miller's Creek became a nightmare of pain, fear, and desperate determination as the small group struggled across the prairie while the fire pursued them with relentless hunger. Ezra's broken legs screamed with agony at every step, and his cracked ribs made breathing an exercise in controlled torture. But Annie's weight on his back seemed to grow lighter rather than heavier as they progressed. "Tell me about your family." "Annie," Ezra said through gritted teeth, using conversation to distract both of them from the approaching inferno. "Do you have any pets back home?" Annie's innocent chatter about her cat and her dreams of becoming a schoolteacher provided a surreal counterpoint to the apocalyptic scene unfolding around them. Behind them, the fire had consumed the Henderson homestead and was continuing its advance with unstoppable momentum, while ahead of them lay uncertain salvation in the form of a creek that might or might not provide adequate shelter. Tom and Martha Henderson stayed close to Ezra, ready to help if he faltered, but the old rancher's determination seemed to transcend normal human limitations. His love for children, honed by decades of caring for his own family, had transformed him into something more than an injured old man. He had become a guardian angel, willing to sacrifice everything to protect innocence. There. Martha Henderson cried out as they crested a small rise and saw the glint of water ahead. "I can see the creek!" Miller's Creek appeared exactly as Ezra had remembered it, a deep pool surrounded by rocky outcroppings and areas of sandy soil that would not burn. The water was clear and cold, fed by underground springs that maintained a steady flow even during the driest seasons. As they reached the creek's edge, Ezra gently lowered Annie into the shallow water near the bank before collapsing against a boulder, his strength finally exhausted by the superhuman effort he had sustained. The fire was now visible as a towering wall of flame less than half a mile away, and the heat was becoming intense enough to singe exposed skin. "Everyone into the water," Ezra commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded respect for 7 decades. "Stay low, keep your faces wet, and don't panic when the fire passes over us." The Henderson family waded into the creek's protective embrace, while Ezra remained on the bank, using the last of his strength to gather wet sand and mud that could be used to protect their faces from the intense heat. His broken body was failing, but his mind remained clear and focused on the task of keeping these children alive. "Ezra, come into the water," Martha Henderson called out desperately. "You'll die if you stay on the bank." But Ezra shook his head with peaceful resignation, understanding that his injuries would not allow him to survive the ordeal that lay ahead. "Someone needs to watch for embers and keep you all calm," he replied. "I'll be fine right here." As the fire arrived with the sound of 1,000 freight trains, Ezra Whitman sat beside Miller's Creek and watched over the children he had carried to safety, ready to give his life to ensure that innocence would survive the inferno that was consuming everything he had ever known or loved. The fire has arrived. Will Ezra's sacrifice save the children? Can they survive the inferno at Miller's Creek? Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to see the incredible conclusion of this heroic tale. The wall of flame reached Miller's Creek with the fury of a biblical judgment, turning day into night as smoke blotted out the sun and the roar of burning grass became deafening. Ezra Whitman crouched beside the water's edge, his broken body serving as a shield between the Henderson children and the inferno that was consuming the world around them. In the creek, Tom and Martha Henderson held their 3 children beneath the surface of the water, coming up only for quick gulps of air before diving back down to escape the superheated atmosphere that would have seared their lungs. 8-year-old Annie clung to her mother with desperate strength, while her brothers followed their father's whispered instructions with the solemn obedience of children who understood that their lives depended on perfect cooperation. Ezra remained on the bank despite the killing heat, using handfuls of wet mud to extinguish embers that landed near the family's refuge, and calling out warnings about wind shifts that might change the fire's direction. His clothes were smoking and his hair was singed, but his voice remained steady as he guided the family through the worst moments of their ordeal. "Stay down, little ones," Ezra called softly, his words barely audible above the roar of the flames. "The fire will pass quickly, and then we'll all be safe." The old rancher's calm presence in the midst of chaos provided an anchor of hope for children who might otherwise have panicked and endangered everyone. His gentle voice, telling stories of his own childhood adventures and asking questions about their dreams for the future, created a pocket of normalcy in a world that had been transformed into hell on earth. The fire's passage seemed to last for hours, but actually took less than 30 minutes, leaving behind a blackened landscape that looked like the surface of some alien planet. Where green prairie grass had waved in the morning breeze, now only charred earth and smouldering ashes remained, punctuated by the skeletal remains of trees and fence posts. As the immediate danger passed and the temperature began to drop, the Henderson family slowly emerged from their watery refuge, their faces black with soot but their eyes bright with the joy of survival. They gathered around Ezra, who had collapsed against a boulder and was breathing with obvious difficulty. "Ezra," Martha Henderson whispered, kneeling beside the old rancher and taking his hand in hers. "You saved us. You saved our children." Ezra's weathered face creased into a smile that seemed to light up the post-apocalyptic landscape around them. "That's what neighbors do, Martha. We take care of each other, especially the little ones who depend on us." Tom Henderson knelt on Ezra's other side, his earlier cowardice transformed into admiration and gratitude for the man he had abandoned to die. "Ezra, I'm ashamed of what I did earlier. You're a better man than I'll ever be." "We all make choices based on fear sometimes," Ezra replied gently, his voice growing weaker as his injuries finally began to overwhelm his determination. "The important thing is that we learn from our mistakes and try to do better next time." Young Annie Henderson approached Ezra with the fearless directness of childhood, her small hand touching his cheek with infinite gentleness. "Mr. Whitman, are you going to die?" The question hung in the smoke-filled air like a prayer, and Ezra considered his answer carefully before responding with the honesty that children deserved from adults. "I'm very hurt, sweetheart, and I'm very old. But I'm not afraid, because I know I did something good today." As they waited for help to arrive from neighboring ranches whose owners would have seen the fire and organized rescue parties, Ezra shared stories of his life with the Henderson children, painting pictures of the prairie as it had been in his youth, and describing the family that had once filled his ranch house with love and laughter. "My Sarah would have loved you children," Ezra said, his eyes focusing on something beyond the visible world. "She always said that the future belonged to the young ones, and that our job was to make sure they had a world worth inheriting." The sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of the rescue party that Tom Henderson had been praying for since the fire began. A dozen riders from surrounding ranches had come looking for survivors, led by Sheriff Bill Crawford and Dr. Samuel Morrison, whose medical skills would be desperately needed for anyone caught in the fire's path. "Over here!" Tom Henderson called out, waving frantically to attract the rescuers' attention. "We're alive, but Ezra Whitman needs help immediately." Dr. Morrison dismounted and rushed to Ezra's side, his experienced hands quickly assessing the extent of the old rancher's injuries. The medical examination confirmed what everyone already suspected. Ezra's internal injuries were too severe for frontier medicine to address, and his heroic effort to save the Henderson children had exhausted whatever reserves of strength had kept him alive this long. "Ezra," Dr. Morrison said quietly, "I'm going to make you as comfortable as possible, but—" "I know, Doc," Ezra replied with peaceful acceptance. "I've been ready for this moment for 5 years, ever since Sarah passed. I just needed to finish one last job." Sheriff Crawford knelt beside Ezra, his weathered face showing the respect that one frontier veteran accorded another. "What happened here, Ezra? The whole county is talking about how you carried little Annie Henderson through 2 miles of burning prairie." Ezra's account of Pike's attack and the family's subsequent rescue spread quickly among the assembled ranchers. creating a buzz of outrage that would eventually reach all the way to the territorial capital. The idea that railroad enforcers had left an elderly rancher to die for refusing to sell his land was exactly the kind of corporate abuse that was turning public opinion against the powerful interests that dominated frontier politics. "Pike and his men will answer for what they did," Sheriff Crawford promised grimly. "This kind of brutality won't be tolerated in my county." But Ezra shook his head with the wisdom of a man who had seen too much frontier justice to believe in easy solutions. "Don't let revenge poison your hearts, Sheriff. The important thing is that these children are safe and that people remember why we came to this land in the first place." As the sun set behind the smoke-filled sky, painting the devastated landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Ezra Whitman gathered the Henderson children around him for one final story. His voice was growing weaker, but his words carried the power of a man whose life had been validated by a single act of extraordinary courage. "Children," Ezra said softly, "I want you to remember that heroes aren't people who never feel afraid. Heroes are people who feel afraid, but do the right thing anyway, because there are others depending on them." 8-year-old Annie Henderson leaned against Ezra's shoulder, her small hand holding his with the fierce loyalty of a child whose life had been saved by unconditional love. "I'll remember, Mr. Whitman. I'll remember forever." As the stars appeared through the clearing smoke and Ezra Whitman closed his eyes for the final time, he was surrounded by the children he had carried to safety, and the knowledge that his sacrifice had created a legacy more valuable than any land or property. The old rancher who had been left to die had found redemption in protecting innocence, proving that true wealth was measured not in acres or cattle, but in lives touched by love and courage. The story of Ezra Whitman's heroism would be told for generations throughout the Kansas Territory, inspiring others to choose compassion over fear and sacrifice over selfishness. His name would be remembered long after the railroad and its corrupt enforcers were forgotten, because some deeds transcend the circumstances that create them and become legends that shape the character of entire communities. Tom and Martha Henderson would raise their children to honor Ezra's memory by helping others in need, creating a legacy of kindness that would ripple through generations. And Annie Henderson would grow up to become a teacher, sharing Ezra's story with countless students who would learn that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when motivated by love and guided by conscience. What an incredible tale of heroism and redemption! Ezra proved that true courage means protecting others even when you've been abandoned and betrayed. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more amazing stories of sacrifice and heroism in the Old West. Share this powerful story with everyone who believes in the triumph of good over evil. What moment moved you most in Ezra's journey from abandonment to heroism? Let us know in the comments below.